Hello students, welcome to Notebook. In his famous book, Culture and Imperialism, Edward W. Said describes imperialism as thinking about, settling on, and controlling land that you do not possess, land which is distant from one's birthplace and is owned by others. He thought that imperialism attracts some people who are the explorers, colonizers, imperialists, while it brings untold misery for other people, the oppressed, the colonized, and the displaced. Syed, a professor of literature at Columbia University, founded the academic discipline of post-colonial studies. He believed that imperialism survives even when colonial empires disappear. Now, who were the colonizers and imperialists? We already have some idea about them from our previous videos. The early colonizers of the Americas were the Spanish and the Portuguese in the 15th and 16th centuries. Their empires expanded till the 17th centuries. Then the Americas, Africa, and Asia were taken over by new colonizers who came as traders from France, England, and Holland. Within Europe too, countries colonized each other. Ireland was colonized by the British. The explorers and traders went to these continents with different hopes and ambitions. While most of them became colonizers, their reasons for colonization or extending control over these areas were different. The English East India Company, which started out as a trading company, gradually turned into a political power. They defeated the local rulers and established control over all aspects of administration and Indian life. In the late 19th century, the European traders entered the interiors of Africa. Previously, they had traded on the African coast. Now, the European countries divided the Africa into colonies among themselves. The Dutch in South Africa, the British in Ireland, New Zealand and Australia, and the Europeans in Australia were known as settlers. The official language in all these settler colonies was English. Let us now have a look at the extent of America and Australia during the time of European settlement and colonization. We'll learn about the European colonization of these lands in our next two videos. This is a map of America North and South from 1794, which shows the different occupation of European powers. This is South America from 1777. This is the current map of North and South America. Oil, gas, and mineral resources were found aplenty in many areas of the Americas, which is why Canada and USA have so many big industries. The earliest inhabitants of North America are known to have migrated from Asia 30,000 years ago on a land bridge across the Bering Straits. During the Ice Age, they moved further south. They are known variously as the Amerindians, the Native Americans, the First Nations peoples, and the Red Indians. Some of these tribes are the Cherokee, Eskimo, Nez Perce, Navajo, Apache, and Sioux. Let us now have a look at the map of Australia in the 18th century and the one at present. Currently, the Aborigines or Aboriginal people form 2.4% of the total Australian population. Other indigenous peoples who occupy the northern part of Australia are called Torres Strait Islanders, who lived in Torres Strait Island, which is part of Queensland, Australia. Legally, Aboriginal Australian is recognized as someone who has Aborigine or Torres Strait Islander descent and identifies as any of these two communities. How were the histories of the Americas and Australia written? For a long time, historians wrote history with a capital H, that is, mainstream history, gleaning their records and information from blue books or government records and official archives. These books, endorsed by the government, were written from the perspective of the early colonizers or discoverers. The Americas and Australia were presented as a product of white man's discovery, the untapped land of their arrival. The oral narratives or personal accounts of the indigenous people could not be found in these accounts. From the 1840s, the discipline of anthropology was established. The anthropologists began to study the lives and cultures of indigenous people and natives. However, most of these anthropological accounts, too, were written from a Western anthropological point of view because the writers were mostly white European men. Since the 1960s, the native Amerindians and the Australian aborigines began writing their own histories. The academic disciplines and the world at large slowly understood that only indigenous people could write their histories best. Native art also began to be honored. It found pride of place in the National Museum of the American Indian in the USA. These arts have been curated by the native Amerindians themselves. Think of this beautiful quote by the brilliant Czech writer Milan Kundera. It can be used to describe the great silence when it comes to writing the history of Aboriginal Australians. The struggle of man against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting. However, it was the Australian anthropologist Bill Stanner who had used the term the Great Australian Silence in his Boyer lectures. With this term, he had described how the white-skinned history writers had ignored the Aboriginal people while writing Australian history. They had not just been absent-minded about the natives of the land, but purposely forgetful about them. Volume 1 and 2 of the Australian Dictionary of Biography had featured 1,182 subjects. Only 8 of these personalities were Aboriginal. However, for the last few decades, academic disciplines like post-colonial studies have tried to reverse this trend. Outside academia too, new writers of Aboriginal identities like Tim Scott, Alexis Wright, and Melissa Lukashenko have been writing their own literatures and histories. In 2017, 210 of nearly 13,000 biographical entries in the Dictionary of Biography were Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men and women. An Indigenous Australian Dictionary of Biography with almost 200 new biographies was also being prepared by the Aborigines and Torres Islander peoples. In the past, the Europeans had seized the lands from the indigenous Australians and taken them for granted. There were no formal treaties like Canada, USA, and New Zealand declaring the takeover of land. Australia was the terra nullius land or land belonging to no one. The Australian government realized this during the 1970s, when guilt about the treatment of the Aborigines had set in. The United Nations General Assembly meetings at this time were discussing the concept of human rights. What are human rights? Human rights are standard norms of principles of human behavior. These norms are protected by municipal and international laws as natural and legal rights, and these are universal and egalitarian. The way the European settlers had treated the Amerindians and Australian Aborigines had grossly violated human rights. Australia is now a multicultural country where diverse ethnic or racial communities cohabit peacefully. The government gives equal status to native and immigrant people living in Australia. Apart from Australia, other countries which now practice multiculturalism are India, Papua New Guinea, Philippines, Canada, Indonesia, Ethiopia, South Africa, Mauritius, United States, Germany, and others. We'll cover the long road from colonization, exploitation, and displacement of indigenous peoples to finally recognizing indigenous cultures and restoring human dignity to indigenous people in our next videos. Till then, let's end with an excerpt from a poem by Judith Wright, the prolific Australian author who wrote about the aborigines with compassion and remorse. You were one of the dark children I wasn't allowed to play with. Riverbank campers, the wrong color. I couldn't turn you white. So it was late I met you. Late I began to know. They hadn't told me the land I loved was taken out of your hands.